Well, welcome. I'm Grell, and we're sitting down for a conversation with Duluth Mayor Roger Reinert right now. And Mayor, thanks for being here.
No, thank you for having the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, you've just recently introduced your budget, which I would say is probably the biggest job of the mayor every year, right?
Right.
Setting those parameters for what the city can afford.
Yeah.
And also trying to keep taxes down. So just in general terms, talk a little bit about kind of what your guiding principles were as you look towards this year's budget,
well,
the 2025
yeah,
budget.
a great question. And I think, of note, we're talking about this in early September. It's kind of a two-step process. The first thing that happens in Minnesota is the city council will set the max tax levy rate. So that's so homeowners can reasonably know what they might pay next year. And what we proposed to the city council was a 1.85% rate that captures new growth. Now this gets tricky. That actually results in a 0% across the board for homeowners. So what that means is because we've had growth in the tax base, we have two choices. We can either add that new growth to the pool and use that money for city expenditures, or we could choose not to, and to be transparent, that would mean everybody's taxes go down. But we did a 1.85% new growth levy, which nets to be a 0% for the average property taxpayer in Minnesota. Of course, the council will take that up at the end of September, and then the final budget will be voted on in December. But to your question, Greg, really did two things. Number one, it kept a promise about pumping the brakes for a year on property taxes. Heard a lot last year about the tax burden between an actual doubling in the city mill rate over the last 8 years, but also just valuation increases. There's been a lot of pressure on property taxes. And I think it's important for folks to know that might be watching, the city is 27% of the levy. The school district, the county are also on your property taxes. So despite what a lot of people think, not every property tax dollar goes to the city of Duluth. But even in that, we were able to make, or at least I recommend making, a couple key investments, and they're related to core city services, and they're related to what I like to call the 5 big issues. So things like our streets and downtown and commercial tax-based growth and housing.
You talked about just now, wanting to prioritize, not putting extra burden on the citizens, but at the same time, there are many needs. I'm sure all your department heads are telling you, gee, we really need to invest here, we really need to invest there. So during that process, how do you make that work? How do you make those numbers come together in a way that maybe the citizens can understand? Yeah,
so we had a very set process, and it began with me saying to directors, so that's our city hall structure. We have the workers and managers and directors, the administrator and the mayor. And I included a letter to the directors that said, we're going to be doing a 0% levy. I know that that's going to mean pressure on us to think about what we do and the resources we have to do it. And so I really asked them to do a few things, to really look at how is what you're doing aligning with core city services, and just that fundamental belief that there are certain things that only local government does. We can choose to do other things, but if we don't do these things, no one else is going to. How are we inviting in our community, whether it's people who want to volunteer to help with things, businesses who want to donate, sponsorships or things like that. And then another big question I asked the directors was, what is it you want to stop doing? This thing that sort of over time has become a part of what you do, and you dedicate staff time and expenses to it, but you've just been waiting for someone to give you permission to stop doing it. So those questions, then they worked on their requests. And I think I mentioned earlier, we had about $1.1 million to work with and a $109 million budget. So we got back, I think, about 106 requests, totaling just shy of $5 million. So then it was really a process of the administrator, myself, and our finance team looking through big spreadsheets and making some decisions about what best aligns with what I see as our pledge to our taxpayers and core city services.
Now, you mentioned that number, $109 million, but that's actually down from the 2024
It
budget,
is,
correct?
right.
Talk about that, explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so a couple things that taxpayers should note in the comparison of last year's budget to this. First of all, last year there was $9 million of spending out of the reserve. And we're not doing that. The reserve is healthy and it's really important. It gives us a good rating with our lenders, so that actually helps keep our costs down. And when we borrow money, lowers our interest rate and our interest expenses. And then also something I talked about in the State of the City, which is really big news that kind of got lost, I think, because it's a bit of a hard story to tell. But we have now fully funded that unfunded retiree healthcare liability, which began with Mayor Don Ness, and we've been contributing several $1 million a year to out of the budget. So we now no longer have to do all of that. We're still doing a little in order to be really assured that we're fully funding that. But the bulk of it we're taking out and we're moving over to pay for my proposed combined maintenance facility, which I also talked about last spring in the State of the City.
Now, in your presentation to the council and to the community, you kind of broke down where the money goes.
Yeah.
You know, you based it on a $240,000 house that pays about $71 in property taxes, and how that money goes. So some of the big ones I'll just touch on, and then maybe you can elaborate a little bit. So public safety, obviously the police department, the fire department.
Yeah. Police department, fire department, life safety. I think one of the big things we've done this year is some of our unhoused and encampment responses was being done out of parks. And that's a tough mission for park staff, especially our parks maintenance staff. So we've moved all of that over to our life safety team, who's better equipped to respond to that, and also has the support of badges, whether that's fire or police, to help with that work. So they're in that public safety arena as well, but that's also our community service officers and along with our badge police officers. So as you said, I don't think surprising to many, hopefully assuring to many, that that's the #1 area that your $71 a month goes to. And I think, as you mentioned, $19 of that goes to public safety.
You broke out another area, and that's transportation, and that's the streets, maintenance.
Streets and utilities.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, and I think it's something, something that I really want voters and taxpayers to know in relation to streets and utilities is we have an aging infrastructure in Duluth. And folks know that. We 2 weeks ago saw a water main collapse on Grand Avenue, right by the Grand Avenue and Central Avenue intersection. That was an 1892 galvanized pipe, 12-inch. That collapsed. It was the original pipe laid in 1892.
And people know anything, 12 inches is a big one. That carries a lot of water.
Yeah. It was funny. The morning I was out there, and Greg, we were both around then, and I had feelings of 2012 because it was pretty significant, a lot of water. Yeah. And I saw our crew, and they were smiling, and I was like, okay, you're smiling. Like, oh, this is 12 inches. Now, if it were 42 inches, we would not be smiling. I was like, okay, I feel better now. But, 1892 galvanized pipe, the original pipe, probably none of us should be surprised that at some point it's going to fail. So our aging infrastructure is something we have to continue to pay attention to. Streets are the perennial topic of conversation in Duluth. And one of the things that the public should be mindful of in streets is our number is about 15 miles a year. That's the number we need to do in order to refresh our street system about every 30 miles, which is about how long it should last with proper maintenance. So that number that we dedicate towards streets and utilities could always be more, but it does reflect that being a core city service.
Now, one that maybe flies under the radar a little bit, but is very important, and that's debt service. And that actually takes a fairly significant chunk. Explain what the debt service is. What are the bonds?
And that number's actually up a little this year because of that proposed combined maintenance facility. And I think I'll talk for a minute about that because I think it really reflects how debt service works and why that's a priority. So, back in the state of the city, I talked about fully funding the retiree healthcare liability. And I predicted at that time that this big announcement would make no news, and I was 100% right. It made no news, and that was this idea of a combined maintenance facility. So spending somewhere in the neighborhood of about $75 million on one combined location where we can both store and maintain all of our rolling stock. Our trucks and our dump trucks and our snow plows and our graders, all of those things, rolling tools that we use to maintain and do city services. What we do right now, and our Jen Carlson, our finance director, loves to show this graph that kind of shows our 7 worst buildings that we own in Duluth. And 4 of them are related to storage and maintenance of streets and utilities. And it also, currently what we do is we will buy new vehicles and store them outside. Things that most Duluthians won't do with their new vehicles because you don't want to expose it to the elements. And we do that right out of the gate. And then also ask our staff to work on them in really difficult environments. So this actually helps decrease our overall operating costs, prolongs the life of those vehicles that we purchase, and gives our staff who work on them a cleaner, safer, and in the winter warmer place to do that. Meanwhile, eliminating 4 buildings from our inventory that are every year increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. But how do we do that? Well, we don't have $75 million in a total budget that's 108. We go borrow. So just like any folks watching this would borrow, you then have to pay for that. And borrowing is how we do that. So that debt service then is paying back those loans, if you will, that we take out for different things.
Well, let's get into that bond rating then, and the city's bond rating is strong, right? And that also makes your interest rate a lot better.
It is, and it's one of the reasons that the reserve is so important, and you don't see us recommending any spending out of the reserve.
Now talk a bit about that combined facility. We'll go on to some other budget items after this, but I'm curious, people might say, well, gee, now maybe there's not a plow truck in my neighborhood. Is that going to change response times at all? Or
no, and it's one of the reasons that I can't tell you yet where it's going to be, because we need to find a centrally located facility that has easy access to major transportation hubs. I think it's such a great question, Greg, and it's something that I try to highlight every chance I can. We are a geographically challenged community. We are 26 miles long by 8 miles wide, and a good comparable is Bloomington, Minnesota. So Bloomington now is slightly larger than us. We're about 87,000 and they're 91,000. They are literally half our size geographically. So think about having about the same number of people, but half the streets, half the water lines and sewer lines and natural gas lines to maintain, and you can easily see why we're just a more expensive city to operate, and also the logistics that we have to think about. But we're committed to finding a location that we can do this, that is easy to access all the parts of our community. So that likely means somewhere in the center of the community, likely somewhere to where we see intersections of major roads like Mesaba and the interstate and central entrance and things like that.
All right, then moving on to some of the individual areas of the budget breakdown. You mentioned it earlier when we talked about Priley Drive, but that's the Parks Department. And I know the community has been wanting to see additional investment in the parks. Where are we at with that in the budget this year?
So we do have the dedicated parks levy. So when you see the breakout of your property taxes, as I said, about 27% go directly to the general fund. There's another 2% that was passed by the voters several years ago that goes directly to parks. What I will highlight in this budget is that the largest single line item is just maintenance. It's facilities maintenance, it's parks maintenance. And that really came out of, one of the things that I've done every month since I took office was go out with what I call our frontline staff. It might be plow drivers, librarians. Most recently, I went to our facilities maintenance staff, and in having that conversation, I usually come on a morning with donuts and just sit and listen. And one of our staff, who's been a janitor for almost 30 years, said, we've not seen our line item for cleaning expenses increased in almost 4 years. And yet we're charged with taking care of these things that the city owns. So the biggest line item is to our basic cleaning supplies, our basic maintenance supplies, as well as dollars to do some additional repair work in our park system.
Now, the library has been a topic that's been in the news a little bit, especially with
Sure.
what might happen with the downtown Duluth library. But library budget is actually quite a small part of that.
It is. Parks is a little bigger, so out of that $71, you I think have the sheet in front of you, but I think it's about $6 that goes to parks, and it's about $2 that goes
Correct.
to the library. One of the recommendations we make in this budget is to add a second safety specialist. That really is about the visitor experience at the downtown library. But frankly, Greg, it's also about having a safe environment for our librarians to work in. Not unlike our fire, not unlike our police. This summer, as we saw some things happening at Priley Circle here at City Hall, not unlike our janitorial staff, lots of folks are now having the work experience of encountering folks who might be struggling with addiction issues or mental health issues, and that has been an ongoing issue at the library. And I'm committed to folks not only having a great library experience, but our staff having a safe place to work.
And last, before we move on from the budget, the internal city expenses.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have to pay. You have to pay for
Right.
the folks that work for you.
Yeah. No, and I think that's important. As you look at that, that's also a sizable number. But I would share with folks that accounts for everything else. So that's the attorneys, and that's actually a place that we do a couple things in this budget. We add another criminal attorney so that we can be serious about enforcing our public safety norms. We add another transactional attorney. So that's somebody who does contracts and also does development deals. One of the things that is very concerning to me is, not surprisingly, when you look at the expense side, 82% of our expenses are people. It's salaries, it's overtime, it's related benefits. But about 73% of our revenue comes from only three sources. Local government aid, that's state money, that's money from the state that's given to us, our sales tax and our property tax. And it's local government aid, our property tax, and our sales tax. And local government aid alone accounts for over a third of our revenue. And Greg, we've been around politics long enough to know that's a very volatile source of revenue. You can see changes in St. Paul, and all of a sudden, I remember when I was a city councilor, then Governor Pawlenty at the end of the year unallotted local government aid, and we had to make some very difficult cuts. So part of having the transactional work is about growing our tax base so we can be a little bit more stable. But whether it's the city clerk or the attorneys or a phenomenal finance team, that all falls into that kind of administrative services part of the where tax dollars go.
No. While we're recording this, it's very soon after you made the announcement, but initial reactions, are you hearing anything from the community, and how was the council reaction?
Well, I think the council's reaction was stoic. They just sort of took it in. They had a few clarifying questions. We've got a full day budget session coming up for the council. First of all, I applaud them for taking a day off of their day jobs. Almost all our councilors have full-time day jobs to go budget or department by department through the budget and really dig deep. Of course, that's open to the public since the council will be there. It's a public meeting. The initial response from the public is supportive. It is exactly what, again, we heard in last year's conversation. It's what I've heard from taxpayers a lot this year. They're feeling the pressure of property taxes. And so, as I said at the start of this conversation, that's not what people can expect from me every year. That's unrealistic. We have the same cost drivers in terms of inflation and salary that everybody else does, but it is in recognition of that. And it's also sort of a pause or a pump the brakes a little for us internally just to look at what it is that we're doing. Are we aligned with core city services? And again, like I said at the start of this conversation, are there things that we could stop doing? Because if there are, then that frees up additional revenue that we can invest in our core services.
Now, we were talking about the presentation to the community. Duluthians care about their community. They turn out big ways. Earlier this summer, one of the big turnouts, or several times, was over some of those public safety ordinances that you introduced along with your city fire and police department staff. Talk a little bit about that, what ended up happening, what got passed, and how that is going to work.
No, thanks for bringing that back up. It already feels like, I think, forever ago, and maybe for the community as well. In the summer, When I came into office, I said to both the new city attorney, the police chief, and the fire chief, both of whom were here before me, what could we do differently to respond to the community's request for additional work in the public safety space? And what they came back with was adding a misdemeanor to the public safety toolkit. And I think it's really important for the public to understand where that fits in to the continuum. So prior to what the council passed, public safety, police or fire, either had an administrative citation, which was only a financial penalty and had no legal weight. I could write you an administrative citation for a fine. You could choose not to pay it. You could even choose to rip it up and walk away, and there was no legal consequence to that. So you can imagine with more problematic behaviors or more problematic individuals, that really was not helping us move either them or these community issues in a better direction. On the other end, you had to get enough of an aggregation of some things to a felony level, which is a very serious legal consequence. So the gap in the middle was really glaring. And we learned a couple things. Number one, most communities in Minnesota have a misdemeanor. We were the outlier in not having it. We were the only one in terms of regional centers, Minneapolis and St. Paul, who didn't already have one. So then the question to police and fire was, well, what are the things that you most often hear about, and what are the things you most often see when you're out and about? And that gave us the list. And so it was things like illegal dumping, illegal ATV use, graffiti, of course, and for the public, graffiti was a great example. We had an individual who, I'm not going to use the tag, but who tagged some 2,000 plus items throughout the community. Well, individually, those were administrative citations, and it clearly did not discourage the behavior. So what we ended up having to do was aggregate enough damage to get it to a felony level in order to take action and stop that individual from doing more. So it really demonstrated the need. Now, of course, the one that got the most attention was illegal camping on public property. Right. And within that, we really were dealing with a couple things. So number one, we had in ordinance that it was illegal to camp in city parks. And it was permissible to camp on private property. That's your decision as a private property owner. But public property that was not designated a public park in between, the ordinances didn't say anything about. So, we had a lot of input. Folks felt like that was really targeting unhoused in our community. That was not the intent, but it was intended to address something that we hear a lot about when encampments pop up. We hear from neighbors, we hear from neighborhoods. And so, I do think that a couple good things came out of it. And you noted we had two very lengthy council meetings. One was 8 hours long with 4 hours just being public input. But two things, really positive things came out. Number one, I think it brought the issue of unhoused and mental health and addiction back to the forefront in our community. And as a regional center, that is certainly an issue that we persistently try to work on. Number two, we were able to come up, in this case, the council said we're not going to do a misdemeanor, we're going to stick with an administrative citation, but we're going to apply it to all public property owned by the city. So we no longer have this gap that was really difficult for police and fire and our outreach teams to respond to.
Now we only have about a minute left, so I just wanted to...
That went by fast.
Went by fast.
Yeah.
Want to wrap up with kind of your assessment of your first 8 months or so as the mayor, and how you think you're progressing towards your goals.
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, I would hope that at this point what people have seen is that I'm really consistent and I try to be very transparent. So the levy is a great example. In my State of the City, I said we weren't going to raise the levy other than to capture new growth. The budget reflects we're not raising the levy other than to capture new growth. I said that we would work on public safety, and we brought forward some difficult public safety things. I'm really committed to doing the things that I say I'm going to do. And I guess maybe relatedly, you also grow into these roles, and certainly came in eyes wide open, having had council service and legislative service, but this executive role is challenging. What I have learned is that everyone thinks every issue is a City of Duluth issue, and they got to tell the mayor about it. And so I've gotten a little bit better at trying to guide those to the people who can best help or respond to those. But I will also share, and I say this as often as I can, not every Duluth issue is a City of Duluth issue. We have a very delineated scope of things that the city does. And we can be a nexus and a connector to some of those other things, but sometimes we have to admit that that is not something the city can respond to, and more often we're just trying to be good partners in doing that work.
Well, I've appreciated your time again today. We're looking forward to doing this again.
Yeah.
Over the course of several months, and
Yeah.
thanks for your time this afternoon, and thanks for watching.
Thank you.